So this is our Wednesday evening session on exploration of the Murli, and we're looking at the Murli of today, which is the 20th of October. And earlier I did do something about the Murli in connection with the aspect of accumulating virtues, cultivating virtues, and handling jealousy. Because when you make yourself move ahead in any field, it does provoke jealousy in other people. And so you need to know how to handle that. There are many things in the Murli, because after all, the Murli is the ocean of knowledge, throwing us waves and currents. And I would like to take up the question of these three expressions, which also came in the Murli, srimat, manmat, and parmat. And I'd like to talk about parmat, because I think it's not very clear to everyone what Baba means by Parmat. We hear a lot about srimat, and it is always described as the directions of Baba, srimat. And then you have Parmat, which is described as the directions of other people. And then you have manmat, which is usually described as your own directions or your own dictates. So that is one way to look at it, but we need to look at it further because it applies in a much, much wider, larger spectrum. The word srimat comes from the Gita, which is called the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And what that means is the words of God, which are the truth, which are pure words, accurate words. And so this srimat is a word which means accurate concepts about what is. And so he talks about the creator and the creation. So whatever information Shiv Baba gives about himself, about ourselves, about the drama, and about the philosophy of karma, all of that is srimat. And this is in contrast to the ideas that are around in the world about these same things. And he calls that Parmat. So Parmat doesn't really mean just anybody's other ideas. It's something much more institutionalized. And so it refers to the ideas of the society in which any individual grows up. And there's a difference in different societies. And these societies are basically divided up into the religions. And what people call values actually corresponds exactly to Parmat. And so you need to know that there's a vast difference between virtues and values. And so values are what people consider to be important. And the relative importance of different concepts is determined by the ideas of that particular society. And Baba is giving the Murli to Brahmins. And Brahmins are predominantly people who have grown up in India or the Indian diaspora. And then there are a few who have grown up in other racial, cultural, religious, national environments. And because of that, there are different value systems, because values are determined by your culture. And because there are different cultures in this world, there are different values that apply to these different cultures. And BKs mostly don't really think about values as being determined by specific cultures, but that's exactly what values are about. Whereas virtues are actually universal, because virtues apply to the soul and values apply to different groups of people. And the largest division of groups of people is by religious background. And then there's also culture, because there is a big difference in the values determined by culture. So we have in the world of Brahmins, people, the majority of people come from the culture of India. And within India, there are subcultures. And so it can be quite complicated, because each culture has its own set of values. And so there is no such thing as universal values, but there's definitely something called universal virtues, because the quintessential qualities of the soul, purity, peace, power, love, bliss, this applies across the board to any soul from any religion, or if they're an atheist, it doesn't make any difference. The essential qualities of the soul are like this. But values are determined by the prevailing ideas of the leaders of the religion or culture that you grew up in. And you will be basically indoctrinated with those values and those ideas by your family and the education system and the religious affiliation that you have. And then you will be also very much influenced by the media. And that means the television, the films, the social media nowadays has a big influence. So all these things are Parmat. And when people come to Gyan, they bring their Parmat with them, and they mix it up with srimat. And so what we are asked to do by Shiv Baba today is to really closely analyze ourselves to see to what extent we have been able to identify the aspects of Parmat that we consider to be part of srimat. And if we are clear about it, then we will make that distinction. And for that, you need the power of discernment. Now, it's really very difficult for a person to be completely independent of their cultural background, because you learn what is right and wrong, what is good and bad as you grow up. And you take that in, you take that on. And whatever corresponds to your conscience, you take it as that is what you think. And as you grow up, there are times in your life where you really evaluate all of the material that has been, as it were, programmed into you by the external moral authorities. And these are your parents and extended family as one of them, then the education system and the religious influences. And all of this is culture. And you do not grow up independently of your culture. You grow up absolutely as a product of your culture. And this is why there are very, very few people who are free and who think for themselves. Now, mostly people don't think for themselves. They say what are their ideas, but it's actually ideas that have been fed into them. And then you see, you come into Gyan. And why do you come into Gyan? Mostly you come into Gyan because you've been looking for truth, which means that even though you have been told all sorts of things are true or are truth or whatever, but you question it. You don't take it on totally. So you are impacted by your culture, but you also have reservations about it. And these reservations that you have take the form of questioning it, challenging it, not taking it on board. And you may think about things and come up with your thoughts about it. And even then, your thoughts, which are maybe doubts or disagreements or something like this, they're also not exclusive to you. They're also part of your culture, because your culture has the dominant ideas, and then it has other ideas which are challenging those ideas, so that the ideas and the challenge to the ideas is all part of the cultural, religious, educational, and parental mix. And that also applies to, the constitution of the government that you live in. It applies to the Declaration of Human Rights. It applies to democratic principles. It applies to whatever is the political affiliation that you go with. And nowadays, there are so many conspiracy theories that these are also part of your environment, and they also include Parmat. So Parmat is quite extensive. And then when you come in Gyan, you take on the Gyan because Baba uses the word recognition. You recognize. And in the Murli today, he said, you recognize me to some extent. Or he said, you are in the process of recognizing me. And once you fully recognize me, then you will be soul conscious. So that means that the impact of your culture is body consciousness. And people don't usually think about body consciousness in that way, but I think that it's useful to include that as body consciousness. So usually people think the 5 vices, greed, anger, lust, attachment, ego, that's body conscious, but it's a very gross and simplistic idea of body consciousness. So if we want to become soul conscious, we need to go into it a little bit more deeply and try to understand what this would be in its subtlest form. So I think one way to do this is to understand that your passage through the path of Gyan You are like the inside of a sandwich where one side is srimat and the other side is Parmat. And so both of these things are coming to you. So if suppose you say, okay, you listen to a Murli for an hour a day, so that's srimat influencing you for an hour a day, but 23 hours a day, you're influenced by Parmat. And as I mentioned this morning, basically Parmat and Manmat is identical. And so Parmat, Manmat is one side and srimat is the other side. And then you experience, as you go along the path of Gyan, that there are times when you are experiencing this clash, and you have to decide when there is a clash of these two influences, you have to decide, do you really understand what srimat is and what Parmat is? Because when you're making a decision about how to position yourself, you have to be really clear what srimat is. And one of the difficulties is that people, BKs, BK teachers, they are describing srimat, but they are not independent of Parmat. And so mostly they will mix up their cultural beliefs and ideas and values, especially their cultural values, and they will mix it into srimat, and they will tell you that that whole thing is srimat, but it's not. It's a mixture of srimat and somebody else's cultural values. And then you have your cultural values, which are different from their cultural values. So your cultural values are mixed with srimat, and it clashes with somebody else's cultural values mixed with srimat. So it's quite complicated. And when he says, really try to understand and extract yourself from your own cultural values and extract what you're hearing from anyone who is talking to you about Gyan from their cultural values, you see. So it is really difficult to function in the world of srimat without your cultural values, because you can't see them. You think it's srimat, but actually it's Parmat, because you're so used to these cultural values that are mixed in with srimat being classified as srimat. And then one day you may realize, no, this is not srimat, this is cultural values. And then you decide, because Baba had told us Brahmin culture. And when Baba introduced this idea of Brahmin culture, everybody said, what's that? And they're still saying, what's that? Because it's not clear. The Gyan is given to us in a cultural context. And the cultural context that Baba gives the knowledge to us in is Hindu bhakti of the type that Brahma Baba grew up in. So Brahma Baba grew up as a Valbhachari. And Valbhachari is a particular sect of Hinduism where people believe in Krishna. And he grew up in Sindh. And so Sindh is currently in Pakistan. But at that time, it was part of India, which was not divided, and it was all under British Raj, British rule. And so there were influences. India had been under Islamic dominance for 7 centuries. And so wherever you grow up, the culture where you are is influenced by these other dominant forces. So where Brahma Baba grew up, there was a huge influence of Sikhism, which functioned politically as a kind of buffer in between Islam and Hinduism in the far north of India. And so in the Murlis, there are many, many references to the Sikh scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sukhmani, and the Jap Sahib. And so you need to know that. So when Baba was speaking to the people, he would make references to these religious aphorisms, knowing that they all knew them, because that was all part of their prayers and their songs and all this. They also studied the Gita. Brahma Baba used to study the Gita every day. It means he knew Sanskrit. He studied the Sikh scriptures, which means he knew the language called Gurumukhi. And he had to know Urdu as well as Hindi and as well as Sindhi, and then also English, because all the governmental declarations and so on were all in English. The legal system was the British legal system. And when people studied in school, they studied the British education system. So all these cultures were there and mixed together. And so they also influenced the language, the thinking, and then wherever you grow up, there are preconceptions that you acquire. And so there are many preconceptions that the different dominant cultures had about each other. And so how the Muslims think about the Hindus, how the Hindus think about the Muslims, how the Sikhs think about the Muslims and the Hindus, how the British think about the Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. And all of these preconceptions drive people's vision of each other. And so these are filters, and all these filters are veils, and they also influence your value system, and they influence your perception, and they influence what you believe. And so it's very, very difficult for a person to be free from all of these influences and just be a soul who is functioning on the basis of an undistorted perception with no preconceptions. It's very, very rare to find a person like that. But when you come in Gyan, you actually have to become someone like that. And you may become like that, but all the people around you may not be like that. So you're always dealing with clashing value systems, perception of one another that is filtered by these preconceptions. And different people are influenced by prejudice. That can be religious prejudice or racial prejudice or cultural prejudice. And all of these things take the form of Parmat. There's a huge influence. And in the middle of all of that, there is the voice of God, which says, you are my sons. So the first thing that has to be crossed is the gender bias, because he says that your bodies may be male or female, but souls are all my sons. And sometimes he says all souls are male. Sometimes he says all souls are female. But whatever it is, it's very important to think of yourself as androgynous or genderless. And that's very difficult because from the moment before you're born even, you are being conditioned according to the body type that you have. And as soon as you get born, people will tell you, this is your race, this is your religion, this is your gender, this is your family, this is what you have to believe, this is what you have to think is good, this is what you have to think is bad. If you dress like this, it's good. If you dress like that, it's bad. All these things are Parmat. And when someone comes in Gyan, especially when they're teaching it, they will, it's impossible to avoid, they will bring their preconceptions into it. And so we are looking at God, looking at soul consciousness through a number of veils, which are thicker or thinner for different individuals. And this is why Baba said you will gradually become free from these things. And for that, you have to make effort. And so what is the meaning of making effort? How does a person become not racist if they are racist? That's a big challenge. How does a person who has a religious bias become free from that religious bias? That's very difficult. How does a person who is negatively impacted by the experience of colonialism become free from that? That's a very, very deep work. And so I think a lot of the challenges that Brahmins experience is because of these veils being there, but they're not really addressed, they're not really talked about. And we tend to think that anybody who has a nice, bright idea about something and then makes a pronouncement and says, okay, this is what it is, and everybody else says, yes, 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 but it may be or it may not be. And so therefore study, real serious study, is to be able to analyze these things in the light of Gyan and isolate through this study where your beliefs that you think is all part of spirituality and all part of Gyan and all part of srimat is actually not, and that it's Parmat. And you may be teaching Gyan with a number of biases that may be something that the person you're teaching is not comfortable with at all, but there's no way to articulate what the problem is because we haven't really spent time on it and we haven't put the words to it so that it can be assessed. And I think that, whenever something becomes a big challenge, then people start assessing it and trying to figure it out. And now that the Brahmin family is very large and there's been pressures on the family because of the current circumstances, partly because of all these COVID rules and regulations have forced us into a little bit different situation, partly because now Bap Dada is no longer speaking through either the corporeal medium of Brahma Baba or the chariot of Dadi Gulzar. And so there are no more Murlis. And the Dadis who were really created by Brahma Baba to carry everything forward, a very high quality spirituality and deep understanding of knowledge and yoga, they're not there anymore. So it's now a historical phenomenon, the arrival of Shiv Baba on earth, and he's speaking and he spoke, and now he's not speaking. And we are studying what he said, and his activity is going on in the subtle regions and not in the material world. And he wants us to be so free from the restrictions and restraints and constraints of our material world, environment, culture, and everything, so that we can become like him, like an avyate person. I think an avyate person would be independent of gender and culture and race and all of this, because the avyate person is just the pure soul with the body of light that is created by the pure karma and the yoga that you have accumulated over your time in Gyan. So that's probably the closest thing to being independent of Parmat. But I wanted to, I will stop there because I wanted to open it up for questions, and we will go further into this subject as time goes by. But let's just have a moment of silence together. Om Shanti.